Welcome to the Danger Close podcast. Thank you for tuning in to this special series on the 1983 Beirut Marine barracks bombing to complement my first work of nonfiction, titled Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine barracks bombing and the untold origin story of the War on Terror, written with military historian and Pulitzer Prize finalist James Scott. It hits shelves on September 24th and is available for pre-order now in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, narrated by Ray Porter. James Scott joins me to co-host this podcast series. Our guest today is Randy Gaddo. Randy is a retired Marine Chief Warrant Officer who served from 1976 to 1996. He was a combat correspondent as an enlisted Marine for nearly 10 years, then a public affairs and media officer for the remainder of his time in uniform. On the morning of October 23rd, 1983, then Staff Sergeant Gaddo was hit full force, danger close, by the blast wave from a truck bomb that demolished the 4-story reinforced concrete building being used as a barracks for nearly 400 U.S. servicemen serving in Beirut. He was one of the first people to respond to one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history that resulted in the greatest single-day loss of life for the United States Marine Corps since the Battle of Iwo Jima in World War II. The attack claimed the lives of 220 Marines, 18 sailors, and 3 soldiers. Had it not been for a cup of coffee, Randy would not be with us today. This is his story. On a day that would end in unimaginable tragedy, Randy Gaddo left his tent for the headquarters building, a route he had done so many times that he knew it took him just 51 seconds. Like Garrity, he was surprised by the quiet morning. Gone was the daily soundtrack of artillery and gunfire. At the last moment, Gaddo decided to slow down. It was, after all, Sunday morning. Why rush? Besides, he could use a cup of coffee. He diverted to the Combat Operations Center, where he poured a mug of dark brew, sweetening it with a couple scoops of sugar. Coffee in hand, he returned to his tent, where he sat at his small field desk and began to jot down notes. The birds were singing louder than I've ever heard birds sing, Gaddo recalled. It was like a symphony.
Thank you for taking the time to do this, and obviously everything that you've done for us in this project and everything that you did in your time in service. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm curious as your path into the Marine Corps, because you came in is it 1976? Is that right?
1976, yes.
Wow. What was your path into service, and why did you choose the branch that you did?
All right, I'll make this the short version of the story. So I never really had an inkling that I was going to go into the military. But my dad, during World War II, he was like the only surviving son, so they didn't let him go in. And as I was growing up, I always saw that when he got together with my uncles, who had all been in Navy, Army, Marine Corps, he always kind of stayed in the background, and I could always tell he felt like, he missed out on something. Mm-hmm. And one of those uncles was a Marine. This guy was rock hard. I mean, this was a World War II Marine to the end. And so I was just out there working in the world, one day. And I was already 23. And I every day when I went to work, I'd drive back and forth past this recruiting station. And, I'd kind of look and I'd go on with my day. One day, I swear to God, I didn't make this decision. The car did it all by itself. It just turned into that recruiting station. And I found myself parked in front of it. And I went in, and there's 4 doors. It's like going to heaven, 4 doors. And first one was Army, and I went in and talked to him for a little while. Next one was Navy, and then Air Force. And then the last one was a Marine. And this staff sergeant was sharp as a razor, everything was just so. And I talked to him for about 2 hours, and finally I signed the papers that day. 2 weeks, and my mom and dad didn't know. I went home and told them. Of course, my mom was, "Oh my God, they're going to turn you into a monster." And so I tell you what, when I got off that bus and got on those footprints, I thought, what the hell have I done? Because the drill instructor's yelling at you. And so, but I never regretted it after that. I tell you what, it was a good decision.
And
Real
what
good
was
decision.
did you know your military specialty when you went in at that
Yes,
point?
I did, because when I went in, I wanted some kind of guarantee. I heard all the stories. Don't go in open contract. So I went in, and the only thing that he had at that time that could guarantee me was this big ock field that included administration and logistics and two or three other things. So I took that one because he could guarantee me that. I I found out later they could have made me a grunt either way. So I started out, they made me an admin guy. And I was in administration for about a year. And I thought, man, I can't deal with this. It's too much. I couldn't be in that office that much. I didn't go in the Marine Corps for that. So then I made a lateral move and became a combat correspondent um, after a year or so. And that's what I did the rest of the time.
And where were you between finishing boot camp and Beirut? And where were you stationed, and what did you do in those years leading up to October 1983?
Well, of course, I was a Hollywood Marine. I went to San Diego. I don't have my sunglasses. Normally, I'm wearing my sunglasses, but
Hey, me too.
I stayed in California for 2 years, and then I went to Beaufort, Marine Corps Air Station, Beaufort, South Carolina. Great place, and right down the street from where James is, as a matter of fact.
Absolutely. Beaufort's an awesome town, man. I love it down there.
Oh yeah, yeah. I really enjoyed it. I actually did 2 separate tours there, and I love that area. But that's before, and then that's where I went into Beirut in '83. My boss that I had worked for previously, Captain Bob Jordan, had become a major by then, and they assigned him as the PAO to lead up a team to go in in mid '83. And he called me and he said, "You want to go to Beirut?" I said, "Hell yeah." And so, can we say that? Can I say hell yeah? Is that okay? I mean, I'm not breaking any broadcast rules, am I?
Nope. Total freedom here.
Okay. So he got me on the team, and when we went in as a team, he flew in first, and then we came in afterwards, about 7 of us.
Before I let James jump in here with some questions, how aware were you of what was going on in Lebanon at the time, and was there any preparation ahead of time that was specific to that region of the world, and were they already calling you peacekeepers at that point? What was that kind of workup or preparation like?
We were peacekeepers from the beginning. I mean, that was the mission when they sent us in there. The first group that went in evacuated the PLO from the middle of Beirut. And I don't know if you've ever, oh, I'm sure you have read into that, but that is a story unto itself. How the French and the Marines went in there and evacuated 16,000, 15,000 PLO fighters from East Beirut, all having weapons with ammo in it, all shooting the guns in the air, went right through the streets of Beirut and got everybody out of there without a single injury. It was amazing. That was just an operation that should go down in the history books as one of the finest. And then they got on the boats, mission accomplished. They were headed back to Moorhead, and the the president of Beirut, Jamal, was assassinated, and so they called him back. The new president, who was his brother, asked for them to come back, and that's when the multinational force was really created. And it was a multinational peacekeeping force from that point on. Peacekeeping being a very dubious term at that point.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick and just give our listeners a quick, that's 82 when the PLO gets evacuated. And then, of course, peacekeeping forces formed at that point, and you guys, when y'all come in as part of the 24th MAU, are really the fifth group of Marines to come in as sort of part of this peacekeeping force. And what's going on in Lebanon at this point really is it's just this huge sectarian fight going on. And so you've got the nationalist government, which is run by Christians, really only controls Beirut and some of the suburbs and areas around it. Meanwhile, you've got various different groups from the Druze and the Sunnis and the Shias kind of all battling over different territories. And so it's really just this, kind of just a sort of domestic chaos, so to speak, in which the Marines are then sent in to provide a stabilizing force along with the Italians, the British, and the French. And so there are 1,800 of you guys that kind of go in there. And when you guys are there, initially, you guys are treated like heroes. I mean, the locals love you guys. Tell us a little bit about kind of the early reception for the Americans in Lebanon, if you will, Randy.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it was that you described that situation very well. It was like the Wild West, everybody had the guns up in the air and yelling at each other. But when, of course, there were, I think, two groups that went in before us, and then we were the third. The MAUs kept rotating in and out every 6 months. The Marine amphibious units with their Marines and Navy and everybody. So, but yeah, when they first went in fact, of course, when we all knew we were going, we started searching for every little bit of information we could get on what was going on over there. And everybody kept saying, "Oh yeah, it's a real cool. Everybody loves it." When we went ashore, there were ladies on the beach, and it was not an opposed landing or anything like that. And there's patrols and everything, but there's partying too. I mean, and they kept talking about the Commodore Hotel. That was the place where everybody kind of the media and the Marine, all the military guys, all the different nationalities, everybody kind of melded at the Commodore Hotel. It's sort of like Bogies, the hotel in the movie. Everybody just congregated there. And so we were really looking forward to going to the Commodore Hotel. And when we got there, it was just when things were starting to heat up. Of course, let's see, in April was the embassy bombing. And then things, they started having patrols get, sniper fire at them, and things started getting a little less pretty, a little more ugly. And so by the time we got there, I mean, it was like the minute we got there, they closed down any external visits outside the compound unless they were absolutely necessary, and that included the Commodore Hotel. So I never did get to see the Commodore Hotel.
It was legendary. That's, as you know, that's where all the foreign correspondents lived. They apparently had a parrot there that could imitate incoming sounds of artillery. I mean, it was a pretty legendary spot in the heart of Beirut there.
Yeah.
So. And tell us a little bit about what were the Marines doing in the summer of '83 on like a day-to-day basis? Kind of walk us through. I mean, because you guys, still patrols were going on, things of that nature. Tell us a little bit about what the day-to-day life was like for folks.
I guess you're talking like pre-August, when.
Yeah, like say from May and June when you guys first kind of got over there. It came a little bit later, but tell us a little bit about, just kind of walk us through the Marine experience for the 24th MAU.
Of course, we had different positions around the airport that we're responsible for, from the perimeter of the airfield to the American University there in Beirut. And just coincidentally, I just went to a doctor the other day who studied and got his degree at the American University in Beirut. We had a lot to talk about. Anyway, so on a daily basis, there was the MAU headquarters compound where you had the MAU command group, and that was the same area where the barracks was, the BLT barracks. And all of that was around the airfield, and everybody had their jobs to do. We were a lot of digging, a lot of sandbags being filled. a lot of bunkers being dug, and then everybody had the training. You did your daily training. For us, of course, we were taking media out to these positions several times a day. There was 300 to 500 foreign and national media there the whole time, and they all wanted to know what was going on. So, and then local media would come in, and we'd take the media from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and find Marines from Milwaukee, Wisconsin that they could go out there and talk to and stuff. So in a way, it was like being on a garrison duty, where you have your daily routine that everybody's going through, training and operations and exercises, and we were running the perimeter. I mean, literally the perimeter, where there were all around us, there's all these snipers and Marines being Marines. We're not going to let that deter us from PT, and so we PT'd on a daily basis, and it got sort of to be a garrison environment until the real shooting started.
Do you remember if any of the more senior guys that had experience in Vietnam, did they have a different outlook on what you guys were going to be doing before you went over there, and then once on the ground? How many people that you were with had experience in Vietnam?
A few. I would say maybe 10%, 12%. I do remember the first day we got there. There had been, at that, before we even got there, there had been pot shots being taken, what we called stray rounds, coming in, because we were in the middle. So if somebody wanted to shoot at somebody over on this side, they had to kind of go through us. So, of course, at that time, I was a young sergeant, staff sergeant, had never been shot at. And first day in there, in the evening, me and the Mao sergeant major were standing outside the Mao headquarters there, and we were talking, and all of a sudden this round zinged through the trees above us, and I hit the deck so hard I about gave myself a concussion. Sergeant Major's standing there looking down at me, and I said, "Was that a round that went through the trees?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, aren't we supposed to hit the deck or something?" And he said, "Well, you can if you want, but it's not necessary." He said, "That was way up there. I wasn't about to hit you." I said, "Well, I'm not a combat vet." And he said, "Well, you are now." He said, "Once you've had that first round go over your head, you'll settle in, you'll understand." And he was right. He was right. You just forget about it. You don't think about it. So, yeah, with the Vietnam guys, I think they were, their experience and just their level of calm for us younger guys was cathartic. I mean, because for us, this was like, we're in a war zone, and but to them it was business as usual. So happy to have them. In fact, Bob Jordan was one of them. He had a lot of experience in Vietnam. So,
did you feel like a target when you got there, or did you feel like that those were actually stray rounds, and then did that morphed later on? But when you first got there, did you feel like you were in the middle of something, or did you feel like you were a target in those initial days?
I would say we didn't feel like we were targets. We felt like we were in the middle. Now, all of us, all those guys on the ground knew that was not a good place to be. But we were there, and so we understood they weren't shooting at us, and things were still, like I said, until July, August. Things were still in the honeymoon stage. We were still, the kids were still smiling at us and waving, even the ones holding AKs and rocket launchers, which we saw some of that. And we felt like we were there on a peacekeeping mission, which still was a muddy phrase. Didn't really understand what that meant from the top down. I mean, I've talked to a lot of top commanders and said, what, and I'd have asked them that question, what was that peacekeeping mission? And nobody really explained that, very well. And so that at first we were not feeling like we were targets, but it got to be more and more. And you probably saw the saloon at some point. You read about it, so about can't shoot back saloon, will shoot back saloon, did shoot back saloon. That's sort of track the progress of that saloon. You can probably pinpoint the dates that we finally decided this. They're shooting at us now. So.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. That's a great to use because one thing too, it's important to talk. Neutrality is a word that comes up so often in talking to folks from Colonel Garrity, looking at the documents and things like that. I mean, the importance that what protected you guys early on was the perception that Americans were a neutral party in what essentially amounted to a Lebanese civil war.
Right.
And so because what's going on in Lebanon is really it's an internal power struggle between the Christians who hold the national government and the Sunnis and the Shias and the different sects and things like that. And of course, the Americans are supporting the Christian national government. At least, early on, it's largely rhetorical. I mean, we are providing training and equipment, but we're not getting actively involved because we're trying to maintain that neutrality. Talk to us a little bit about the neutrality and also about where you guys were located and why it was such a bad spot.
Well, let me talk about the neutrality, because when you look at that term neutrality, even though I think from the highest level on down in the National Command Authority, there were good intentions, doing what we did. But about good intentions and the highway to hell. And, looking back, or even for those of us who were on the ground, we knew it at the time. Look, how can you be neutral when you've gone in specifically stating that you're supporting the Lebanese government and at least 3/4 of the groups were fighting the Lebanese government? You can't, there's no way. So it was a dubious, term to begin with. There really never was neutrality. It's just like I said, we had the honeymoon phase where everybody loved us. We were new people. We were trying to do something good. Multinational force did give it a bite, but so the neutrality, part, it never was valid in our opinion. And then as far as our position, and Colonel Garrity, I'm sure has told you, this, even you can't put Marines on the flat ground with the water behind you and mountains on three sides and expect that we're going to be able to establish some, and then tell us you can't establish anything that looks like an offensive position, can't have weapons that you're carrying ammunition in. You've got to look neutral the whole time. You can't. That is totally against Marine doctrine from 1775. So, again, it was. I know it was done with good intentions. I think that somebody had a real, and I'll go from the presidential level on down. I think there was an honest desire to help in a part of the world that was in turmoil. But somebody on the senior staff should have been jumping up and down on somebody's desk saying, no, do not send the Marines in and put them on the ground. Don't send any of our military and put them on the ground in a static position in the midst of 20 dueling, factions from neighborhood thugs to national entities, national armies. You got Syrians, you got the Iranians involved. It's just that position, and then the decision to put all of those troops in one building, of course, was totally against what you normally do, but we had no other choice. And we can talk about that building too. Everybody thought that it was fairly impenetrable.
Yeah, why don't we, before we get to that spot, I was just going to say there's a great line that one of Colonel Garrity's officers said about your tactical position at the airport. He said, quote, our tactical position is possibly the worst since Custer at Little Bighorn.
Absolutely.
Because as
Absolutely.
you're literally backed up against the sea. You got mountains all around you. You've got hostile forces basically on all sides, and you're sitting in a fishbowl at the bottom of a mountain. And
Yeah, and your hands are tied.
And your hands are tied. So
yeah,
tell us about when things start getting really hairy for you guys as the summer of 83 rolls on and the overshots that you're experiencing early on start to get more and more intentional.
Yeah, I think it was around July, probably. And you probably have these dates in your head better than you have. You've done this research day in and day out. You've been living this, but I think it was around July that things started to. That's when the saloon kicked in, because at first the rounds were just small caliber, going over our heads. But then after a while, we'd be getting these stray mortar rounds coming in at, close or danger close, or at least close to our positions, causing us to scuttle into our bunkers more and more often. And then the heavier stuff started coming in, the artillery, and the Syrians got involved and started shooting from the mountains, the big artillery. And I think when we found ourselves more and more having to hit the bunkers because the rounds were getting bigger and they're getting closer. And there came a point sometime in late July, early August, when we started saying, these aren't stray rounds. Now, of course, in the media and back in the world, that was still, oh yeah, they're taking some stray rounds, which became sort of a joke to us, and you've probably seen some of the cartoons of sitting ducks and the stray rounds coming in. So I think it was about that time that we started to realize this was getting real. And that term was used then a lot more. We started looking at each other saying, this is getting real, because at first it was kind of, oh, there went another round. And, you got used to it and you stand like the sergeant major did. So it's like, yeah, we're combat vets. But I tell you, when that first artillery round shakes the ground right next to you, you're moving like a little mouse. So it became real at that point.
So, and as it's getting real like that, you guys suffer your first casualties. The first guys start getting wounded, first guys start getting. How does that change for you guys, your thoughts on the whole mission and safety and things of that nature when it starts getting real, as you said?
Yeah, well, then you start getting mixed feelings, because at first you're not mad at anybody because you realize they're shooting at each other, they're not shooting at us. But then when the first casualty, your side, your people are killed or injured, and that it was intentional. There's no way two mortar rounds can drop in the same position accidentally. You know what I mean? So I think at that point we started to really dig in and say, we better start treating this thing like the real thing. But again, it was so frustrating because they still, the mission changed at that point. But I mean, in reality, on the ground, the mission changed. When they started shooting at us and and throwing, the heavy stuff at us, at our positions. The missions changed, but our rules of engagement stayed exactly the same,
There's a pretty good line Colonel Garrity said. Colonel Garrity, of course, was the commander for our listeners of all the Marines there. And he said, the mission changed, but no one changed the mission. And so by
Right.
that, the circumstances on the ground were evolving very, very quickly, but no one in Washington seemed to appreciate this radical change in the ground circumstances and rectified that by changing rules of engagement, things of that nature that might have allowed you guys to better protect yourself. And when I was going to use one thing here, you talked about how the aim of these guys, it was a great line in one of the newspapers in the summer of 1983. They quoted an anonymous Marine who said, when the shelling starts, you figure that 1, maybe 2 rounds hitting us here is accidental. More than that, it's just good aim. So, I think that's exactly what you were kind of getting at there, Randy. Was like, hey, it became very clear to us this was they were no longer stray rounds. They were,
well, yeah, and we could tell because they were triangulating. I mean, they were walking them in. They'd start, in the distant, and they get closer, and they're definitely walking them in on us. Now, sometimes it was because the Israelis might be, in a position right next to us, or the Lebanese were, co-located with us in a lot of positions. So that's when it got muddy, because you think, all right, well, they're shooting at them, but we're here too, so cease and desist. They didn't really, the enemies didn't really differentiate that. It was, if you're with them, you're with them. And that's where that neutrality thing came in. It was hard to sell the neutrality thing on the ground when they saw our troops at positions with the Lebanese army, and with the Israelis and with the others. So it became very difficult to sell that neutrality story.
Yeah, one thing that stood out to me in doing this research was the administration talking points and the peacekeeper using that line over and over again, talking about these stray rounds, and talking to the guys that I got to meet, particularly at the 40th anniversary commemoration event last year. You guys were in combat. There's no question about it. When I listened to these guys tell their stories, listen to you talk about what was going on down there, there's no question, 100% you were in combat. Yet when we go back and look at administration talking points, interviews from that time from senior administration officials, they went out of their way to try to make sure that the American public, the citizenry, was really not that aware of it. When we're talking about precision in language, reflecting precision in thought, they were very precise with their language in trying to shape a narrative that was not what was actually happening on the ground.
Yeah.
You were in the public affairs side of all this. So how did that affect the Marines on the ground, the servicemen on the ground, and you in particular, because you were probably more keyed into that than somebody else? Like, how much news were the guys getting from home? Was it a daily thing? Was it a weekly magazine type thing, like a Time or a Newsweek? Were they aware of the narrative back home as compared to their situation on the ground? And how did that affect morale? And was your position on that different just because you were in the public affairs side of things?
Well, let me go back a second and talk, when you're talking about the Vietnam guys before, and the perception of being at war. The Vietnam guy, Major Jordan, would always tell us, and he was in Vietnam, he was in the middle of it in Vietnam. And he said that he never experienced that level, that intensity of heavy artillery, mortar, rocket barrages on any one of his positions that he'd ever been. He said it was the most artillery. And a lot of the other Vietnam vets said the same thing. They said it was because we were in that fishbowl. It was like we were such easy targets. It's like waving our hands. So it was, and they kept telling us, they said, hey, if anybody tells you you were in combat, BS. you aren't. This is combat. So, but to your question, it became obvious that what we were seeing on the news was not what we were seeing. And it was interesting because the media guys that were there on the ground with us, they had been in Beirut longer than we had. I mean, some of these people made Beirut that was their beat. That's where they were for years, you know. So they knew it better than we did. And they would I think if you look at the print media probably had it more accurate than the broadcast media. Broadcast media, I think, tended to maybe at higher levels, maybe things got edited because the guys that were on the ground, they were doing the shooting, they were doing the reporting. They would send it over the wires. It would go to Washington or wherever, and then they had no control over it from then on. But we did have, you know, the American Forces Radio TV had come out there with they had it all set up where we could get news feeds in. They might be delayed 12 hours or whatever, but you know, we'd get them in fairly, and we'd watch them and we'd say, what? That's not what happened. What are they, you know, they'd still be talking about stray rounds when we're obviously not taking stray rounds. So the most junior PFC out there knew that it was BS what was being broadcast back home. They knew that. And, you know, so it was frustrating. And then as our guys started getting shot, hurt, killed, that started getting people, that's when the morale started to, you know, be affected. But I think Colonel Garrity will tell you that, you know, these guys, between us, when we were talking to each other, we'd be saying, this is bullshit, you know, but they never let that go. They never let that go beyond that. They were professional about it. They knew their place in the system and they knew how they were supposed to react. That's not our place, you know, to tell. Now, Colonel Garrity, and from the commandant down, he made it very clear to us as PAO guys, do not censor these Marines. If the media asks them a question, you let them answer it. You don't stop them. You don't censor it. And we didn't. And, you know, it was, and there were times when guys had come out with stuff, but it was obvious they were frustrated. Now, how much of that made it back to broadcast? I don't know. I don't think a lot of it did. I think a lot of that got cut for whatever reasons, political reasons, whatever. But the troops on the ground knew the score from the junior guys on down, but they were all very professional. They really did. They did know what their place was in the system. So,
yeah, I mean, because by September, I mean, you guys are using 100,000 sandbags that month alone to build fortifications against artillery. And Randy, you know, I got to give a little shout out to you here because, you know, as the Root Scoop editor, and for folks who are listening, the Root Scoop was the weekly newspaper for the Marines there, and it came out on Fridays. And Randy was the editor of it, and it is a phenomenal piece of history. It charts week by week the events in Beirut from, you know, the beginning all the way through the bombing and the aftermath. And you edited that, and it really is sort of the rough draft of this history that you guys did. And fortunately for Jack and I, there's a whole set of the Root Scoops on file in the Marine archives. And so we were able to go and look at your handiwork and chart it week by week by week. And again, just terrific job for history in putting all that together, Randy. And so it was through one of your Root Scoop articles that I was able to learn about the fact that by September, you guys were burning through so many sandbags that the Sixth Fleet had to go outside a theater to get more of them. You know, you had 100,000 sandbags as guys were fortifying bunkers and everything. You went so far, you wrote a great article about how guys were actually calling these things sandominiums, not condominiums, but sandominiums, because they were building them. So tell us a little bit about like what the environment was like in September as things are really, really heating up there for you guys.
Well, I'm going to make clarify a point first. I was the editor of the Root Scoop while I was there. The Root Scoop started sometime early when the Marines went ashore, and each team, every 6 months there was a different editor for the Root Scoop, and you probably saw the difference in style and writing and stuff, as you went through it. But I was the editor during the time I was there.
And it was the best while you were the editor, Randy. That's what we're trying to say here. It really reached its zenith of journalism excellence under your
All
guidance.
right. Well, I'll take that. That's Bob Jordan. But as far as sandbags go, that is true. And that was when I was asking me what were you guys doing on a daily basis. I was not being facetious when I said we filled a lot of sandbags. We got very professional at it, and the character of the bunkers began to take on, palatial, aspects. I mean, these guys, you give them. They're a little bit bored one day, and they get out there. Let's do something with this. So they had them stacked 3-4 high. They could go in little hidey holes. They could go, and it became sort of a pastime to see what you could do to your bunker. But it was that was half jokingly. In reality, because that intensity of the incoming was getting so much worse at that point, we needed to. That's the only defense we had. Other than standing out in the open, if we didn't have decent bunkers, you had to find a building or. And of course, underground is always better. So we had no choice. It wasn't done. We had to have fun doing it. So we made it fun, but it had a very real purpose, and that was because we were getting hit more heavily. So, but yeah, sandbags were part of our life. We got to loving sandbags. And I can remember standing up on the university one evening with this young Lance Corporal machine gunner on his corner nest. Each corner of that university parapet, they had a sandbagged machine gun nest. And he and I were standing there talking. And I think I was kind of interviewing him and asking him how he's doing and, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden we heard this. And I looked over and there's two, and he's standing right here. And then right between us were the sandbags. And we look up back and there's two little holes in the sandbags with sand leaking out. And we realized somebody targeted us. So of course we hit the deck. He got up, he went into his nest. He saw where they were shooting at us from. And we had to go through the whole thing where he called his, this sergeant, the corporal of the guard, sergeant of the guard, to get permission to shoot back. Because, the rules of engagement where you had to clearly identify who was shooting at you. He saw who shot at us. And he finally got permission to shoot. And I tell you what, he let loose. And he got some payback. They stopped shooting at us after that. So we assume he was successful.
And so in that summer, I think a lot of people unfortunately have forgotten April 1983 and the embassy. Most people
Yes.
October, but they're kind of it's a little bit hazy unless they have a personal touch point with it, an interest in that part of history. If they're a certain age in 1983, they might remember. But the embassy in 1983, people tend to have forgotten, and then throughout the intervening months between April and October, that there were U.S. servicemen killed in Beirut, and those people tend to concentrate
And injured, yeah.
October 23rd, 1983, rather than that than what happened in those intervening months. What can you tell us about those attacks and the effect on you guys on the ground?
You mean of the embassy?
Nope, of what happened during those intervening months when you started to lose guys.
Well, one of the first things we did when we got there was we went to the embassy grounds and walked it to see. And that was, a gut check. You talk about getting real, you saw it was real for these guys. And I'm glad you brought that up, because when we talk about the first shots fired in the global war on terrorism, I don't think you can separate those two. It was a continue from that point on. That was the test that,
Randy,
at the embassy.
if we could just mention real quick for folks who may not be familiar with this, that was in April of 1983 when a similar situation, a car bomb, was utilized as an attack on the American embassy there, blew up the whole front of the embassy, which collapsed, killed 63 people, including 17 Americans, and wiped out the Central Intelligence Agency's office there in Beirut. And so that's really the beginning. That kind of kicks off this summer of violence that you guys are then going to be dropped right in there. So tell us, backing up, and I'm sorry to interrupt you on that, go back to telling us what it's like to go see the ruins of that embassy.
We were young, dumb, and bulletproof, of course, at that point. So we're walking the grounds, and it's in the middle of, there were a lot of bad people all around there. I'm sure what the weapons trained on us was we were there, but we were sort of oblivious at that point to that, because it was early on, and we were still kind of getting accustomed to the ground. But I think that was still a gut check for us when we saw the level of destruction. And I'm sorry, rephrase your question. I lost my train of thought on it.
No, I was just gonna say, going back to me, when Jack and I were interviewing folks, we talked to folks who went inside that embassy, and went in and saw the ruins of it,
Right.
still, people, because the bombing had taken place at lunchtime, and there were still like food left out, desks still there. I mean, it was like just this haunting scene of like what a bombing would do. And so some of the Marines went and toured it, and to kind of see that firsthand. I don't know if you did that when you were there. I know you went and visited, if you went inside the building at all.
No, we really didn't go inside at that point. We didn't have time. We just kind of jumped off, walked around, and got back on the Jeep. But it's funny you say that, because when I had a lab on the second deck of the barracks building, the BLT, so that we could process our film and send it out to the bases and stations in the Marine Corps and elsewhere. And we got at that time, there was no digital. It was all film. So it was the whole process, you had chemicals and everything. And you had to have that big drum dryer. And for some reason, the embassy had one. And we learned about it through some source. And so the big drum dryer that I used actually was the one from the embassy. So, you got to recycle everything. But it was, I guess, sort of a harbinger to have that in there. I didn't realize it at the time, but so I don't know, did that answer your question? That didn't answer your question. I'm sorry. My mind is wandering to other things.
I bet. I mean, there's so much that happened between October. And in that lead up to then October 23rd, what is the last thing you remember other than that morning? And I want you to, I'd love it if you would tell your coffee story and how coffee may have saved your life. But the evening,
it did.
The day before, what are some of the last day you remember before the bombing? What are your memories of that last day? And then I'd love to hear you talk about how coffee saved your life that morning.
Well, the day before, as you recall, we had a USO band come in to shore, and they played a rock concert, or country rock kind of concert, right there in front of the BLT. And I'm sure you got that picture somewhere of the guys out there in the steps and a little natural amphitheater. And that was a big thing for us to have a band come in like that. But the morning of is what I really remember. It was well, the day before I had all the correspondence that the Marine Corps correspondents that worked for me. I was a press chief too, so I assigned who did what stories, and I had told them I need all your film in here because tomorrow morning I'm going over and I'm going to soup all the film and get all these things done, because that day, that Sunday, we were due to waterproof our bunker because the rainy season was coming in. So we had this big sheets of plastic, and we were going to fill more sandbags and then put the plastic down, and you know, so that was going to be the task of the day. And I didn't want to say, oh, I got to go and do some film, you know, so I can't help you fill the sandbags. I didn't think that would go over well. So I said, I'm going to go over her. So I had 8 rolls of film in my pocket that I was walking over there at 6 o'clock. I got up early because on Sundays they let people sleep in a little bit, and you know, there was hot breakfast down there in the chow hall in the basement of the BLT. And so I got up early, and I said, I'm going right over there. So I'm walking over, and I timed it. It takes like 1 minute to get from where I was in our big CP tent that I shared with 3 other staff NCOs on the team to the BLT. So it was right around the corner. So I'm walking over there, and the birds are singing. I mean, it was a cacophony. It was I almost had one in earplugs. They were so loud, and I'd never heard that. The whole time I'd been there, I swear to God, I'd never heard that. And it was very quiet in the hills. No fire, no gunfire, no artillery, nothing going on, you know. And it was just a beautiful October morning, kind of cool. And I got about halfway over, and I thought, man, I got to have a cup of coffee before I do anything. So I turned around at that point and went back to COC, got a cup of coffee, and sat down at my little field desk. And I'm making some notes on what I got to do and who I got to send film to, and this and that and the other. And then at about 6:20, I started pushing myself, you know, out of the chair to get up, and I heard the M16 fire inside the compound, and it stopped me. So I'm kind of halfway up in my chair like this. I thought, that sounded pretty close, you know. And then I heard this and felt this thud. It was just a ground shaking thud. And then I felt a rush of hot air on my face. Literally, it felt like, you know, when you see the astronauts pulling G's, my skin felt like it was being pulled back, and it was hot. And then a millisecond later, I got hit by that. It was a Mach 2 blast, they later determined, from that bomb. And it just picked me up and threw me back against a case of MREs that was in our tent. And it flipped me backwards, pretzel. And then, of course, when the blast wave went by, there was a vacuum. So it sucked me back down to the floor, and I went out. And I was probably out for a couple minutes, and I woke up and I was dizzy and disoriented and didn't, you know, the rest of the staff NCOs in my tent had all been sleeping, and they're on the floor in their sleeping bags because it blew them off the tents, and they're all wiggling around like little worms, you know, trying to get out of their sleeping bags. And none of us knew what was going on. So I said, get in the bunker and let me go find out. We thought we got hit by an artillery round or something right outside the tent. And I walked out of the tent, and immediately there was this corner of a building between me and the BLT where we had to walk around the building and then down a hill, and then the BLT was down there. And I looked over the building, and there was this mushroom cloud just rising up. It was still rising up. And so I ran over there, and my back was, I didn't realize it at the time, but I had gotten, you know, my back was thrown out of whack and stuff. But you're young and bulletproof, you don't worry about things like that, right, Jack? But I went around the corner of the building, and where the BLT should have been in view at that point, it wasn't. I could see the airfield on the other side, and they had a small control tower over there, and I could see that control tower. I thought I shouldn't be able to see that control tower. So I kept going around the bend, and then I noticed all the leaves were blown off the trees. All the leaves, the trees were all bare. And then I started seeing things like I saw a ammo cover from an ammo case driven into a tree. I thought that's what. So I was still in shock, and so I still wasn't registering yet. And then as I rounded the corner, went down these stairs where the BLT was, then I started seeing, the bodies and the body parts, and then I realized, the BLT wasn't there anymore. And so I turned around, ran back, and because I was the only one around at that point. A couple of guys wandering closer to the BLT, but I think they had actually been, danger close. I ran back, and Major Jordan was coming out of his hooch, and he had a door blown off its hinges onto him. So he was all dazed, and everybody was dazed because that shockwave went through everybody. It was just enormous. It blew out windows miles away. It was such a huge explosion. The FBI, said it was the biggest non-nuclear explosion that they'd ever experienced. So I told Bob, I said, the BLT is gone. And, I could see he did not register. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I'm telling you, the BLT is not there anymore. It's gone. It's got blown up. And, so then we went into rescue and recovery for several hours, and until he pulled me off the media was, wanting to know what happened. And we gave him full access. Well, not full access, but so yes, indeed. Had I not stopped for that cup of coffee, I would not be here talking about this, because where that photo lab was, 3 days later, I was there when we dug it out. And because I kept thinking, well, maybe I could have dove under that big iron, wheel, the drying wheel, because that thing was huge. Or maybe I could have gotten under that oak desk that was in there. Well, it was flat. The whole thing was just, So that's when it really hit me, and then late in the day, I happened to be walking, and I reached into my pocket, and those rolls of film were still there. And that's when it hit me. Holy, I should have been in that building had I not. And that's, I still, when I think about it, I still get the willies, because, that was just one of those, somebody was watching out for me to make me turn around. So
every time you have a sip of coffee today, do you think back?
Absolutely. And I have 2 cups of coffee in the morning, whether I need them or not.
Wow. And when you first walked out there, was there dust in the air? What did you think when you saw?
Oh, yeah.
Did you start to dig right away, or did you use your hands to try to move things? What were your first actions when you walked up on that scene? But maybe describe for people.
Well,
still dust in the air, that sort of thing. And then did you use hands, tools? What was available to start in those recovery efforts?
Well, I honestly think 9/11, all the pictures of 9/11, that's exactly what it looked like. I mean, everything was covered with cement dust, and concrete and rebar was just twisted everywhere. Chunks of concrete, thousands of pounds had been thrown, a distance, and there was rebar sticking out everywhere. And so, like I said, the first thing I did is went back and told Major Jordan, and then we came back with stretchers and our racks, anything we could use to carry people out. And the first thing we had to do was get a path made to get into, because when it came down, the 4 stories came down like this. So in the middle here was this little A-frame that of not little, but it came down like an A-frame. So the sides were here and they were pancaked. But in that middle, we figured there might be some people still, that we can get to. But we had to make a path to it because, like I said, the rebar and concrete was just strewn all over the place. And that was a job just getting in there, but it was all hand stuff. We had no other tools than Marines, and we made a path. Go ahead.
I was just saying, if I could jump in for our listeners, this was the battalion landing team headquarters building and barracks, and it was a 4-story building, and it had about 350 people staying in it. Okay. And when we talk about the 241 who were killed, those were Marines, soldiers, and sailors, another 112 injured. So it's a huge 4-story building that we're describing. For folks who may not have seen the photos and things like that, that's what Randy's talking about when he's talking about what that building looked like. So it was a huge, largest non-nuclear attack the FBI had ever investigated. And so, Randy, kind of picking back up where you left off, it's ankle deep chunks of concrete everywhere and rebar. I mean, for folks, continue with that mental image of what it looks like for everybody.
Well, and to further talk about the building itself, it was a aviation administration building, I believe, to begin with, and it's early. But it became the headquarters for the PLO, for the Israelis that had their headquarters in there, and 2 or 3 other groups that had, so it was a heavily, had walls like 2 feet thick of concrete. This place was supposed to be impenetrable. Literally, I was standing on top of the roof one day with some guys, and this rocket came in below us and hit the side of the building and just bounced off. I mean, this building was supposed to be impenetrable. Nobody ever conceived that somebody would do what they did and how they did it. But I'm sorry, one more time, your question.
No, just again, it's what that scene looks like. Because I mean, you've come across one of the largest terrorist attacks ever affecting Americans up to this point, and you're describing what that scene looks like. So it's ankle deep concrete. You can't see the sun because it's just so much concrete dust everywhere. I mean, the debris.
Well, the concrete dust was still going up. It was amazing. Even after I ran back, told Major Jordan, got everybody together, and we ran back. That probably was 2 to 5 minutes. The cloud was still rising. That it took forever for that dust and debris and then it started raining back down on us eventually. So during the rescue, there's all kinds of stuff falling out of the sky, and snipers were set up, intentionally. Snipers were shooting at us while we were trying to do the rescue, which that's a common tactic. But then once we got the path made to the building, then you had to go inside of that A-frame. That was a spooky, scary thing to do, because you're seeing all this rebar and concrete piled up over top of you, and you don't know if it's done with its falling down. But you just do it. You just do what you got to do. And so we went in there, and there were little fires cooking off everywhere. Cook off that had been in the building that and they were cooking off in these fires, and it was hard to differentiate man, beast, or stones. I mean, everything was covered with this gray dust, and it was very difficult to see a human form. So we had to literally dig around or listen. And one thing happened to me and guys that were searching around, and we heard very faintly, somebody yelling, but we couldn't tell where it was coming from. So I yelled, I said, just keep talking constantly until we find you. So this guy belts out, he starts singing the Marines hymn just as loud as he could. He kept on singing a verse. I mean, he sang about 3 or 4 verses of it. And then we finally found him and dug him out. And miraculously, the guy was able to, I helped him a little bit. He was still walking and talking, and thanks for getting out of there. So, but at the same time, me and I think it was Father Pucciarelli, our chaplain, we up high on the top of that ark, we saw a sleeping bag, and we could tell there was somebody in it, and they were moving. But we couldn't get to them, and even if we could have, there was no moving. Thousands of pounds of concrete to get him out of there. I mean, it was sandwiched, and the poor guy, we watched until he stopped moving. And Father Pucciarelli said a prayer, and we moved on. But we found guys. I found one guy that, as we were trying to load him onto the stretcher, his internal organs started to come out. So I had to put him back, and I'm holding him while they're carrying him out on a stretcher, and trying to keep him intact. And we put him on a truck, and I don't know whatever happened to him, but yeah, it was a scene from hell. It really was. It was that's about close to hell as I ever care to get.
What medical did you guys have? Med kits, trauma kits? What was in those kits at the time? What did you have available to you? Because a lot of the corpsmen were in that building. Did you carry tourniquets?
They were in the building, right?
Yeah.
We didn't have a whole lot available. No, we we had to make a makeshift morgue, and we had to we put them on to get to them to any credible medical. We had to put them on whatever vehicles we had at our access, and get them over to the MAU, or to the Marine Amphibious Unit logistics area, because they had docks over there, and they had equipment and gear that they could medical equipment that they could do. And then the rest of them, they got put on helicopters and taken out to the Iwo Jima, was just offshore, and they had full medical. So a lot of guys went there, and then from there they went wherever, and a lot of guys got, it didn't take long for the Lebanese Red Cross to get there. And so they started taking people, and they put them in their vehicles. We didn't know where they were going. We lost Colonel Gerlach for a couple of days because he got brought to I think it was an Italian hospital, or he got brought to a hospital, and one of the reporters, Robin Wright, actually kind of stumbled upon him as she was, working to get interviews with people at the hospital and she found Colonel Gerlach, who was the 1-8 commanding officer. He was very seriously injured, still in a wheelchair today. But it was so chaotic that trying to control it. And then, it wasn't long before a lot of people wanted to help, and they started bringing in heavy moving equipment, but it was a bit chaotic because it was hard to have anybody in charge at that moment. There was so much going on. And so you had, I was taking some media around, I think it was the second day after. And I was taking media around. We kept them in a tight group and let them go around the perimeter and take shots, and, kept them out of the way of everything going on. And there was this one Lebanese guy with a big old bulldozer, big boy bulldozer. And we saw it happen, and I said, "What is that guy doing?" And he got the bulldozer, the shovel under this huge wall of concrete. I mean, like a wall. like 20 feet long and 10 feet high. He's going to lift it. I think what he intended to do was to lift it and shift it over. But of course, as he lifted it, that was the weight just counterbalanced, and it came right down on top of him. And he had that metal protective thing over him, but that thing squashed, and we saw blood squirt as he got crushed by that wall. I don't think he made it. Of course, then they had to go in to rescue him, and so that took resources out. So it was a bit chaotic for a while. Just trying to you got to figure a building that big. You can imagine the perimeter, and everybody on different sides. We were digging with our hands. I mean, that's the only way to get some of the stuff out of there. And it went on for days and days and weeks. I mean, rescue went on for days, and then it went into recovery. And that was a very appalling job to have to do.
Yeah. Do you remember your first thought when you realized that the building had come down? Did you think that it was possible that anyone survived? And then what did it feel like when you pulled the first survivor out of that rubble?
Let me just make a note here because I want to say something about that later. Well, yeah, like I said, the first guy we were able to pull out was a guy that was singing the Marines hymn, so that was pretty. I mean, the Marines coffee saved me. The Marines hymn saved him, so I'm sure he sings it daily. But we had no time. There was really no time for conscious thought. It was just we saw what had to happen, and we were the only ones there to do it. So you just went in and you did whatever you could do, to get these guys out. There was everybody wanted to help. When Major Jordan came to me about, I'd been working 4 or 5 hours on the rescue thing, and he came and he said, you need to come out with me. I said, oh, what do you need me for? He said, well, you got a job to do. You got to take these media. The media are at the gate, 300, foreign media, national media at the gate, and we need to get them access. And so we worked out a plan to get them in a few at a time, and then we took them around in these little groups. And but nobody wanted to quit. Everybody wanted to stay at that task, because to us that was the most important thing at that time. And so anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I was gonna say, going back to, I mean, when you guys first get in there, I mean, guys are using their K-bar knives, they're using their hands. Eventually, There's some shovels and there's some sledgehammers brought in. People are using cots and ponchos for stretchers, broken pieces of plywood from the building. I mean, and then, as it sort of builds up into, Ogier Lebanon, which is the big construction company that helped out after the embassy.
Yes. Yeah, they're the ones that
sends out the equipment, and they can start lassoing these bigger pieces of concrete and moving them that way. But it really is one of the things that struck me, and kind of going through everything and talking to guys, guys and looking at the documents, is just how you guys had to improvise the organization to attack this, particularly when ended up with Italian volunteers there and Lebanese volunteers.
Right.
It's like using sign language to denote, you dig on this corner, you dig on that corner. And yet it's really, and Jack and I talked about this at length. I mean, it's really one of the greatest rescue stories in modern history, because you guys, everybody's impacted by it. I mean, whether, you're in the building or not, the shock of it, and yet the ability to bounce back and immediately begin the digging, the medical, the triage. I mean, all that is just such an astonishing story. And, and I mean, dealing with the media that afternoon, I mean, it's like that, it's everything continues to go forward on that. And so, Jack and I've talked at length about just what an amazing story rescue this really is.
You're right. You're right. I never, you know what? I to this day could not tell you who was in charge of that. You know, it was like you said, like for instance, when I ran back, we got stretchers, we came back, and there were still not a lot of people out there because everybody was still picking themselves up and trying to figure out what the heck happened. And so I saw two or three young Marines, and they were in shock. You could tell they were in shock. They're just wandering around. So I felt the staff NCO, I better take charge of these guys. So I yelled at them. I said, "Come on over here. We need to clear this area. We need to clear a path." And they just kind of looked at me like, "Who are you?" And I got, pissed. And I said, "Get over here. We need to get in there and help these guys that are still in there, And so then they snapped out of it. They were just in shock, so deep. They didn't know what to do. So it took, a small unit leadership that we learned in the military. That's when that kicked in. Whoever was there needed to take charge and figure out what to do. And what to do was who knew what to do. But to this day, I could not tell you who was in charge of the whole lash up. I mean, you may know, James, but I don't. I do remember seeing Colonel Garrity walking around the perimeter just to get it. And he has had this look on his face like, man, because he tried to tell them. He went back to Washington at least 3 separate occasions and tried to tell them, you guys have put us in a no-win situation. You got to change this. And, so he was a good man. He was a good man. He was a good Marine. He probably would have been commandant. And to this day, I would say that he became a scapegoat for that. And I'll say that to anybody to their face. I believe he became a scapegoat. Wrong. He was not the man to blame. But you know what? He's a Marine, and he took full responsibility as the commander. He absorbed that, and of course, so I have no doubt that that affected his career. But anyway, I couldn't tell you who was in charge of that rescue operation. I don't know. That might be a good story in itself, but I don't know if you could even track down. It would be hard to track down, anybody who was involved in that from a leadership position. So,
well, Garrity did move. He moved his headquarters out to a Jeep so that he could be mobile and be on the site that morning. So, I mean, he and Jack and I both had the privilege of having dinner with him and you at the reunion last year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Family, and he's a tremendous individual. But yeah, he was definitely out there traveling around. Doug Redledge, I think, was also very heavily involved in the rescue efforts there, and his guys.
Right. He would be, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then I think you really it came down to small unit leaders, exactly like you said. Somebody's telling guys, you do this, and
right.
And kind of responding to it. But regardless of the sort of flow chart, it worked because
right.
Folks to remember too, this is a race against time. These guys that are still alive are frequently alive because they're trapped in a bubble underground. The 2 walls kind of created an A-frame over them, or they happen to be underneath, a desk or something like that in this little pocket, and and they've got tons and tons of concrete and rebar on that you guys have got to dig your way out, and it's a race against time.
Yeah, one thing I always wondered about, and again, not being rescue professional, bringing in the heavy equipment and starting to move those big walls around always seemed to me to be kind of counterintuitive. I guess we didn't really have a choice, but to me, every time I saw one of those big pieces of equipment moving a lot of concrete, I'd think, wonder what's under there,
Yeah, and we've talked to Chaplain Wheeler, for example, who's was buried under that, and he was buried under a precarious 2 pieces of concrete like that, and as rescuers were moving, he could feel the increasing pressure on his head. And you're absolutely right. I mean, that you move any piece of that big Jenga game, so to speak, and it shifts everything around. And There's
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, that's and it's, but I don't think you really have a choice. You can't do it all by hand because it we'd still be there trying to dig that out. It would have been impossible.
Some of those
So,
slabs were too heavy. They were huge.
yeah. Going back, I was gonna mention it because you said how did you about how did you guys feel about after the bombing and stuff, and it's interesting because I was bringing media around, and this was probably the first group of media I think that I took around, and there was a woman there who was a radio reporter from somewhere, and we Marines were all extremely frustrated. We were pissed. We knew somebody had hit us. We wanted retribution. We wanted to be allowed to go out and do what we were trained to do, but we didn't know who to, the retribution was to be aimed at that point. But this woman reporter asked me, said, "How do you feel after seeing this bombing and seeing all of your fellow Marines and soldiers and whatever killed?" And I stopped and I turned around and looked at her, and I knew I shouldn't do this, but I just couldn't. I said, "That is about the dumbest question I have ever heard a reporter ask. How do you think I feel?" I said, I said, "Don't ask that question I think it's Marines because you'll probably get the same answer. We're frustrated, we're pissed, like any human being would be." I said, "But so I shouldn't have done that." She was asking a valid question. It's just that the level of frustration at that point had reached beyond the boiling point. We were all just, over the top. We wanted to get out and get something done, to either pull us out or let us do our job. But this was unacceptable. And so that was
Speaking of that, I mean, you're suddenly at the front of the biggest story in the world, Randy. You've just come through this bombing that day, and by lunchtime, when these reporters are showing up, you're now about to be the face of America in front of the globe. What are the ground rules? How do you handle that? I mean, how do you handle in a situation like this the media?
Well, fortunately, we had already established a really good rapport with the media that was there. And like I said, there were probably 300 permanently stationed there or had been there for a year or more, covering all this, because they'd started during the Civil War, and some of them, and that was their beat. So we had established, because as Marines, we want full disclosure, minimum delay. That's our credo when dealing with things, and from the highest level, the guidance had always been, don't limit access to those Marines on the ground. Let them talk. It's their story. Let them talk. So we brought the media first. Of course, they wanted to go around the building and just to get a feel for that. But then we started taking them out to the line companies and letting them talk to Marines out there and ask them, what'd you see? What'd you hear? How did it affect you? And things like that. So the media was, I won't say on our side, but we had established very good relationships with all the major media. So we were able to talk to them and explain to them, look, during this rescue effort, we have to limit your access, but here's how we're going to do it. We came up with a plan to take them in small groups around and let them do what they had to do. They had a job to do too. And we wanted the world to know. We didn't want to, this was not a secret. So we fortunately had a good relationship with the media. We had a lot of fun with the media. We really did. There were some really good people, really good men and women, mostly guys. I have to say, but Robin Wright was one of the ladies that was there, and there were a couple others permanently. But most of these guys were just male journalists out there, on war correspondence. And did I ever tell you about Shit River?
I'm familiar. We're familiar with it as far as its marking on the map, but and whatnot. But what anecdote do you have about that?
It was All right, so I'm there 2 days. I don't know where I barely know where the latrine is. Okay, hadn't been out to line companies yet, and so I figured we'd take a little time, Bob Jordan, and get us out there and show us around. And Bob was a very gung ho kind of Marine, always was. So he comes up to me, second day we're there. He says, "Hey, get your gear on, Gaddo." I said, "Oh, where am I going?" He said, "You're going out to Bravo Company." And I looked at him, I said, "You do know it's condition 2 out there, right? Condition, we had these condition levels, and condition 2 is meant we're taking sniper fire." He said, "Yeah, so get your gear." I said, you want me to take media out there now?" He said, "They want to go out there and report this, and we're going to get them out there, and you're going." I said, "Yes, sir." So I went and got my gear on, and he throws us on a Jeep. He's driving. Throws us on this Jeep. There's like 6 or 7 media, and we're hanging off the sides, and you got camera bags flying, and he is driving like a maniac because he knows he's a moving target is harder to hit. So I don't know where he's going because I hadn't been out there yet. So he wheels around and stops, says, "All right, get off here." And we're at this low point, and there's this bridge that's going over, a wooden bridge going over some sort of a creek or something. It was this canal. And I said, "Well, where am I supposed to go?" And he said, "They're over there. Bravo Company's over there." And he points across the bridge. And then he takes off. And so now the media is looking at me like, "Okay, what do we do?" I said, "All right, we got to go over there." Well, I meant over the bridge, but Frank Doherty, he was a freelancer. I think he was working for Life or one of the big magazines at that point. He was standing to my left and right next to this, whatever that was, a canal. And I saw him starting to take the step, and I said, "Frank." It was too late. He had already shifted his weight, and the camera bags were shifting his weight. And I tried to grab him, and I couldn't. And he went in, and he went under. And when he went under, there was just this bloop. This, and I swear to God, Shit River was literally that. It was in the middle of Beirut. All of the refuse that hit the streets eventually ended up there. And there was a layer about that thick of stuff on top of, you can't really call it water. It was sewer water. Well, it looked like ground. It really did. It looked like ground. So Frank looked, and when we pointed that way, he assumed it would be quicker and safer not to go over that bridge and sniper fire. So he steps down, and he just came back up. And I tell you what, nobody wanted to touch him. We're all laughing. We're laughing at him, and nobody wanted to touch him. I had to go and find a branch, and I said, I pulled it in on a branch, and we took him. He had to get rid of all his clothes. They burned his clothes. They gave him a uniform, a set of camis to put on, and they made him shower 3 times. And we were still laughing at him. That became sort of our company joke,
Well, the medics probably gave him a shot of something, or
They did. Technically, they did. Tetanus. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Maybe 2. I don't know.
yeah, probably a couple things. Oh my goodness, wow.
Yeah.
That is wild. And do you remember? Was there a story about some? I mean, I can only imagine the tensions between the guys that are exhausted, pulling friends out of the rubble, Marines out of the rubble, Navy corpsmen out of the rubble, soldiers out, and digging with their K bars into the next night, through the next day, and then having media come around and taking pictures and asking questions. What were some of those tensions that you remember from that time? And was there a story of, did you have to kick, or somebody have to kick a couple of reporters out of there for something?
Yeah, we actually did. What was his name? Now his name just escaped me. Big reporter he did the vault that they went in, and then there was nothing in it. come on, guys, help me here. Come on, James.
I can't remember their names. It was two ABC guys, and there was a report that you guys wrote that we found in the archives where y'all threw them out of the compound because they were let's see, for failing to check in on arrival and for using combative language and poor attitude of the Marines.
Oh, that was a different one. This one was a very famous reporter. His name was escaping me, but
Let's see, it wasn't like Tom Friedman.
he was on, I think, CNN at the time.
Okay.
Of course, he came in with his everybody.
It wasn't Geraldo, was it?
Geraldo, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Geraldo. Thank you. So he came in there and, he felt like he owned the place. And we were at that point a bit protective of, and we were told by the FBI who was there doing the investigation, they said, nobody takes pictures of this site. Nobody comes in. So he was talking with Major Jordan, whatever, and I kind of hung back, and because I suspected something. Sure enough, his kind of snuck around. And I saw him heading toward the compound, and I saw him take some pictures. I went up to him. I said, "I'm gonna need that film." And he said, "You're not getting the film." I said, "Oh yes, I am." I said, "Orders are nobody takes pictures. I'll take your film, and if somebody higher than me wants to give it back, you'll get it back." But so I took. He reluctantly gave me his film. I stuck it in my pocket. Totally forgot about it. And then after I got back home, maybe in January, I get a call from John Shotwell, who was then the head guy for PAO in the Marine Corps. And I knew him well, served with him. He said, "Randy, do you have a roll of film of Geraldo's?" I said, "Yeah, I guess somewhere." He said, "Well, they want it back." So I guess they wanted it pretty badly. So I did find it actually a week or so later and sent it back to him. Yeah, we kicked. The French reporters were very pushy. They didn't understand limitations. But for the most part, the media was good. I got to say, they were sympathetic with what was going on. They understood the rules, and of course they did what they could to push them, but if pushed they would back off, and so for the most part I gotta say the media was very supportive of us over there.
What do you remember in the days following the bombing as those rescue efforts turn into recovery efforts?
The smell. That, I think that would, the smell was really, after about the second or third day, and that heat and everything, you couldn't go anywhere within a football field's length and not just get knocked over. And then, of course, we didn't have time to go back in after that. We were too busy with the media, but guys that had the opportunity, the time to go in, it got into their clothes. The smell was just, embedded, and it's not a smell, that you forget ever. And so that's the big thing I remember was the smell and the, the tenacity of these Marines, sailors, soldiers, rescuers. They didn't give up, even when they knew there was no possible way there to be rescued. They just kept up with these recovery operations to the end, and it took weeks, and so it was frustrating, but I think we all got numb after a little while, and just now, as I guess, the thing that pulled us out of it was the fact that things didn't exactly stop after that bombing. I mean, the attacks continued, so we were still having to deal with the day-to-day attacks. Mortar artillery was still going on. We were still intensifying, if anything. And I think all sense of neutrality at that point was gone. There was no way anybody see us as neutral forces, at that point. And it's a sad thing because, a lot of us always think about, had we stayed the course there, would that have stopped 9/11? If we had faced terrorism at that point for what it was, that level of intensity of terrorism, that big a bomb to keep the Western forces out of the Middle East, had we stood at that point and said, no, we're staying the course, would that have prevented the planning and execution of 9/11? I don't know. That's kind of a rhetorical question, I suppose, but I think it's one that needs to be asked. Oh, and I think it's a good teaching point. I know that a lot of the Beirut bombing is taught in the military schools as a point of tactics and strategy, how external forces can affect the popular view of what's going on, and that was the whole intent, was to affect the public perception and the public support for keeping forces there. And of course, what did we do? We all pulled out. So that was a point of success for the terrorists. They saw that tactic worked really well. So they continued it on. Years there were other major, not as big as that one, but other major attacks like that on the core towers and others like that. So right up until 9/11, when they used airplanes instead of trucks to carry the load.
What's so interesting about mentioning that too is, in the aftermath of this, as Congress gets involved in their hearings and things like that, and there's a real effort to kind of put the blame on the Marines for security and whatnot. And you see that in the testimony of Colonel Garrity, and you see it of General P.X. Kelly saying, you're missing the forest for the trees here. This is not an issue of domestic security at the compound. This is a new form of warfare. This is terrorism as warfare. And, and at one point, Kelly is testifying in the fall of 1983, and he's getting pushback from some of the lawmakers. And he finally says, what is it going to take? A kamikaze and an airplane before you people wake up? And it's like, that's exactly what happens 18 years later. It's an airplane. It's, in this case, it's 4 airplanes. It's the Pentagon, the World Trade Center, and it's, Pennsylvania. And so it is. That was very haunting when we found that. And we're going through this congressional testimonies, reading that, and be like, wow, he was ahead of his time.
It's funny. I think I told you the story about Captain Winter and his daughter, whose first name I can't recall, but his daughter came to one of the reunions, and I think it was possibly the 25th remembrance, and she showed me a letter from her dad, and she was just a baby. She was an infant when he left, so she never really knew him, but he would write her letters every day. And he was trying to just tell her, about what was going on, what dad was doing, keeping a daily log of it. And he said in one letter that she showed me, he said, a lot of people back home are asking, are we really doing any good over there? Why are we over there? And he said, I'm here to tell you we are doing good, because he said, if we can stop this terrorism now here, if we can stop these people here, then that means we will be able to prevent something bigger from happening, in the future on our own soil. and he was killed in a bombing. And that just when I read that, I lost it. You know, it's just, and she showed me some of the other letters, and you know, he was just a proud daddy writing home to his baby, and never saw her again. But prescient thinking, and who knows? I don't know, but I have to believe that, you know, it's like the bully in the playground. Until somebody stands up and knocks him on his ass, he's going to keep picking on people, you know. So I mean, it's a big, you know, Iran is still at it. You know, they haven't backed off this. They are still using, and you know, it's interesting that some of the same people who were involved in the Beirut planning of that Beirut bombing were involved at some level in the planning of 9/11, or people who were trained by them, you know, who learned under them. So you can connect the dots pretty easily, I think. But I don't know what you do with that then, you know, because it's such a big international subject. I don't know how you stop it. You know, it's like whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
You whack one and two others pop up. So it's a cultural, you know, it's a cultural and it's a generational thing. Terrorism and hatred of Western forces is embedded in many of these cultures from childhood. So, and I saw that firsthand. I mean, I saw kids looking at us, and they had their fingers on the trigger of loaded weapons, and you could see the hatred, you could see it and feel it. So, how do you fight that? How do you combat that? I don't know. And that's why I'm so glad you're doing this whole series, because I think it has to be a series. You can't just do it in one. You know, it's a continuum. So,
as you said, there's a lot of dots to connect there. And in a related question, at what point on the ground, or what were your thoughts, yours personally, and the other people in your peer group and your sphere of influence? What were their thoughts on a U.S. response? Was it something that you thought at the time was for sure going to happen because we're the United States? And were you surprised when you went after, especially after there's tough talk, and how, I don't know how aware you were of was going on in the States at the time, and what the messages were coming out of the executive branch, and then to leave quietly in early the next year in 1984. Did you expect the U.S. response that really didn't materialize?
well, yeah. I mean, you know, there was talk about who was responsible, that they had pinpointed somebody responsible, but it's like, they didn't know. That's what I'm saying. They didn't know how to respond. They didn't know who to, you know, who to exact that retribution on, and if so, how to get to them and not cause a lot of collateral damage and then create more chaos, you know. So it was a new, at that point, it was a fairly new, I think, concept. And the terrorists were sort of, there's been terrorism obviously since the beginning of man. Somebody was always terrorizing somebody, but terrorism at that level, at that planned and supported by national, you know, governments, was a pretty new concept, I think, and nobody knew exactly how to find the people who were responsible exactly, without just kind of carpet bombing and, you know, blowing up whole cities. So I think that caused the lack of response. That it was more a lack of knowledge on how to, you know, who to go after. but we were surprised when they pulled out like they did. Yeah. We expected them to go in, and it's, one thing I learned personally from this all is take anything for granted. And let me tell you a little scenario that happened like 2 days after the bombing. We thought, after the bombing, that compound got bermed up. They had a 12-foot berm around the whole thing, and the only access point was one gate, and there was a 50 cal trained on it. And you didn't come in or out of there without looking down the nose of that 50 cal. And so we thought we had the compound sewed up. And me and a young sergeant worked for me, Hardy Slate, were walking down this road that went past the Mao headquarters 2 days after the bombing. And we thought everything was tight. And he stopped and he looked. And he said, that little road that goes right up over that hill connects with the main highway on the other side. I said, yeah. And he said, all a truck would have to do is come off that main highway, come over this hill. Mao headquarters is right here. I said, holy shit. I ran in and I got Major Jordan. I said, come here, you need to look at this. And he came out. I said, holy shit. He went in and got the OPSO. And he came out and he said the same thing. And within 30 minutes, there was an old abandoned bus across there with a berm up again, and they tightened up. And that taught me that you can't assume anything, and you can't assume things are safe. You have to verify and re-verify and revalidate it. And believe me, I've driven many people crazy now because I've gotten overly, I guess, I will ask the dumbest question in the room if I think it needs an answer. And so I think that's something that we as military might take to heart, is that when you're dealing with these people, you can't take for granted that they're going to act like you think they're going to act. It could be something totally different. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, certainly.
Randy, you'd mentioned just a few minutes ago about, that very powerful story about Winters and his daughter and whatnot. And I think, that's something that Jack and I felt very personally in working on this book, was that, the legacy for so many people in today's day and age, when the media is just drowning you out day after day after day, an event like this is within a week, it fades to the back pages of your newspaper. But for folks whose families were there, they're going to spend the rest of their lives without a son, a husband, a dad, and that this has a transformative effect on so many lives. And, and I think that's a huge part of this story that typical readers may not understand, is that, and one of the most powerful things I think when we were dealing with this was our meeting with Lisa Hudson, whose husband, Dr. John Hudson, was killed in the blast. And
right.
She told us, she said, I never remarried, even though she was really young at the time, because I never met a man I loved as much as John. And he had a 9-month-old son who grew up, and, he spoke to the Beirut veterans at the 30th. He said, his speech, which
very powerful,
very, very powerful. We quoted it in the book. He says, I'll never have someone call me son. And that just gutted me, because we both have kids. All of us have kids, we've been there, you understand that. And that led to, I think, a very important organization that you helped spearhead. And I was going to get you to tell us about your efforts with Major Jordan to create the Beirut Veterans of America.
Think about this. The Marine amphibious units would rotate in every 6 months. We were there for 2 years. There were 1,800 Marines or 2,000 Marines, but there were also thousands of sailors on those MEUs, and every MEU was a different MEU and different people for the most part. Now there were some repeats, but so think about all of the tens of thousands or more of people, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, sons, daughters, sisters, brothers, that were affected during that whole 2 year period that they were part of that Beirut, whether they were getting shot at or not, they were there, and their families knew it was a dangerous place. And so you had a lot of families. So a lot of people just think, they don't realize that the volume of people that were affected over that 2 year period, more than you would realize. But you saw at the 40th remembrance, we're into the third generation now. We had the mothers and fathers, and unfortunately, they're getting older now. But you had brothers, sisters, and then you had sons and daughters who now have sons and daughters. And I think in some cases there may even be a fourth generation. And you saw how many. We had 800 people at that banquet, and because that was the capacity. We would have had more if we had more capacity. But and this is 40 years later, and to me, that's amazing that people would continue that heritage all those years later. But Bob Jordan, I was still active duty, and he called me in 1991. I was in Atlanta. Actually, I had taken a position that he had held previously as the PAO for the 6th Marine Corps District in Atlanta. It's a recruiting district. And he called me and he said he and a couple other guys had been talking and felt like we needed to do something to remember these guys. Now, the beautification committee down at Camp Lejeune, they had already planted the trees, and the Beirut Memorial was already sort of in the planning at that point. But he said, I think we need to have an organization that Beirut can identify with, fellow veterans. So that's how we got started. He said he became the president, I became the founding vice president, and we had one other secretary treasurer, and we developed the bylaws and started the organization. So it was a labor of love, and of course our slogan was, the first duty is to remember, because that was always the intent of this, was never to be a political organization or anything like that. We were there simply to make sure that this event was not forgotten, because we knew at the time that it was something different. We just didn't have a name for it at that point. But we just wanted to make sure that these people were never forgotten. And so I think the fact that we're here talking about it 40 years later, that we may have had a small contribution to that. We've had remembrances every year since 1984, and then every 5 years we do the bigger ones that you guys were at. So it's a way to stay connected, and I think we have had some success in getting this word out here. None better than what you're doing, James and Jack. Really, again, on behalf of the Beirut veterans, want to express our appreciation for y'all doing this, because it's a long time coming. But definitely something that is, I hope mainstream America will read and understand that many of the organizations and entities that were involved in that are still exporting their terror. It's not a done deal yet. So
can you talk a little bit about what happens every morning of October 23rd at the memorial and the reading of the names?
Oh yeah. Every at 6 a.m. Every October 23rd, at the Beirut Memorial in Jacksonville, North Carolina, we get together, and it's families, veterans, close friends. anybody can come, but it's not advertised as a public thing. It's more for the families and veterans and close friends. And and usually there's several hundred or more people in attendance. And we read each name on the Beirut Memorial Wall because we feel that by naming that name out loud for that moment, that person is alive again. And, the way I think I put it this past year is that we all have families, friends, veterans, we all visit the wall. We say that name, and for that moment, that name is alive, but these guys are there all the time. Their names are on the wall, but they live in spirit 365 days a year. We come there once a year and honor them, but they live here all year. We got to remember, it's not just once a year. It's not one day a year. We need to remember that they live. Everybody's got a future that they'll never know. And that's the story you tell about Doc Hudson, is a prime example. What a loss to society. This was a great man. He could have been a great man, but his son is a great man. So, he's passed it on. But so, we again want to make sure that people understand that even though we do this only one day a year, in our hearts, there is not a day that goes by that I don't think about Beirut in some way, shape, or form. So it's just something that stays with you, and it always will, and it always should. We shouldn't forget it. So.
And, I had the honor of being there last year in the 40th anniversary for those commemoration events and the reading of those names. And I'd like to read some of the things that you said that morning. And you said, they are not just names. They are real people with personalities and passions, virtues and vices, good days and bad days, and with people who love them. When we read each name, that person comes alive again in our mind and in this place where they join us and their fellow heroes to continue celebrating their lives. We who read the names and listen to the names are only visitors. The men behind these names will live here for another year, waiting to remind us again next year that they died as heroes, American Marines, sailors, and soldiers, as peacekeepers. So our first duty is to remember. I could barely get through reading that.
Yeah, I know. I did too.
Yeah.
I had to practice it many, many times before I could get through it without.
I understand.
Sure.
I understand. Such powerful words. And I want to thank you for not just your service to the nation, everything you did on that day and the days since, and with Beirut Veterans of America, and keeping these memories alive and these lessons alive. And it's an amazing thing that you've done. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Randy.
Labor of love.
Here with this.
Thank you for tuning in to the Danger Close podcast. Be sure and pre-order your copy of Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine Barracks bombing and the untold origin story of the War on Terror. You can pre-order wherever books are sold. You can find me at Jack Carr USA on the social channels. OfficialJackCarr.com is the website. Click on shop in the upper right-hand corner for the merch. And if you got something out of this conversation, be sure to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Until the next time, take care out there, stay safe, be strong, keep fighting.